Join the crowd.
There you go. Watch what you say now.
That's a good sign.
I missed what they said. Did you just get married or are you?
Oh, we are getting.
We often.
Well.
All right, I guess we can go ahead and get started. It's right at 7. Welcome. Let's start with this. Since you're here for, if you're not here for Lutheran 101, you're in the wrong place. But so this is just really an introduction to what it means to be a Lutheran. I see that many of you already know some aspects of being a Lutheran, but some of you don't. And so I'm going to shoot for about 1 hour each week. It's 5 weeks, and we'll go through things like today. We're just going to talk about who is this dude, Martin Luther. Next week, we'll talk about this word grace and why it's so important to us as Lutherans. Then we'll talk about sacraments and what our understanding of the sacraments are. Then we'll, the 4th week, talk about how we read the Bible typically. And oh my, Dave and Sue Ritter.
Crazy.
Yeah. Now I'm intimidated.
Sorry, right outside.
And then we'll the last week talk about worship and what worship is and what worship isn't. Let's start though by going around the room, introducing ourselves and saying how long have you been, if you are or consider yourself a Lutheran. And when that word Lutheran comes up, what's like some of the first things that pop in your mind? And be honest, okay? I'll throw out the same rules as hello. Come on in. Here, we'll pull over some chairs here. You want to be able to see this.
Your name?
Yeah. So name.
It's a good memory.
Name. When I say Lutheran, what's the first thing that pops in your mind? And like I said, be honest. And how long have you been, if you consider yourself a Lutheran or not? Okay. So we'll start over here with Kenny Rogers.
Okay. Hi, I'm Mike Carr. I graduated from Capital, and I guess that's I've never really gone to church for a while there. And I thought all I had to do was play basketball and didn't have to worry about the rest. But a little caveat, I didn't get everything paid for at the 3 schools, so I had to make some money, and I found out that if this was in 1962, if I found out that I was a Lutheran at Capital University, I would receive $100 per semester given by the Lutheran Church. And I said, well, I'm nothing. I might as well be Lutheran. And that's what got me started. Wow. And I went to Christ Church across the street and met Pastor Lang, and I had never known a pastor in my life. And I was so impressed with him. I loved him, and I went through the catechism with him, and he became a real good person in my life. So that's how I became a Lutheran. I've been around obviously since then. We've been a member here since 1973 or 4.
Yeah. Okay. That was 5. Good.
I'm Tom Wilkinson. I'm a Lutheran my whole life from birth on. And the first word that comes to mind when I think of Lutheran is grace.
I'm Val Wilkinson, and I've been a Lutheran all my life. My great-grandfather was a minister. And the first thing that comes to my mind is Christ-centered.
Okay.
I'm Linda Honaker, and I've been a Lutheran all my life. I do not like our bishop.
Oh, okay. I was hoping we'd get some lame answers, not just the national one or the local one? The one. Oh, okay. The local one. Yeah, we'll talk about that at some point.
I'm Margaret Allen, and I've been a Lutheran all my life, 72 years now, I guess it'll be. So that's all I've ever known.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just been part of my life. My parents, I grew up on a farm and we went to a little country church and that was life.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right,
There was nothing different.
and the first word that pops in your, what did you say?
I don't know, just going to church. I mean, that's what I did. I mean, I don't know if that's popping into your brain or not, but that was, it's always been church centered for me.
I'm Karen Bachmann, and I've been a Lutheran all my life, and, I don't know, I have to just say church.
I'm her other half, Chuck Bachman. I didn't say better.
Little slick was cut now.
And we started out, when we were born out in Valley View and went to the Lutheran church out there and then moved up here and went to St. Paul and then now here. Just always been a Lutheran.
Okay,
I'm Kathy. I was raised here at Peace Lutheran Church. I'm from the charter families actually of this church. I'm actually a mix between Roman Catholic and Lutheran because my dad was Roman Catholic, so I get the mix of it.
okay.
I'm Devin, and I was baptized Lutheran, so I kind of consider myself Lutheran, my whole life.
Where were you baptized?
Advent Lutheran Church.
Oh, in Crown County, in Upper Hamilton?
Yeah, that's where my dad grew up, and.
Heck, another pastor there.
Oh, yeah. And I think, tradition is a word that comes to my mind, and I say that because my husband and I went to a church that was definitely very contemporary, and it just really was not doing it for us. And I had come to Peace when I was younger for a good chunk of time, and that's what we were looking for, was a little bit more tradition, and so we really enjoy it.
Good.
I'm Terry Dittmar, I'm her mother, and the word that comes to my mind is liberal Catholics. I was a Catholic, but I was married in the Lutheran church at
Okay,
30 some years ago, so because that was my husband's church. So I definitely prefer the Lutherans over the.
careful, we have some Catholics.
Well, it's fine. I always felt like, the Catholic tradition was just so strict, and that's how I grew up, and
Yeah.
I like a more relaxed version.
Okay.
I'm Bob Burge. I am, as a lot of you are, I'm not from this area. I've been a Lutheran my whole life, at least as far as I can tell. My mother told me early on, you'd be a Lutheran. My grandparents were migrated from Germany and Sweden. Most of my background in the family is Swedes. And I grew up in Southern California and we went to Lutheran churches out there. And so I was baptized, confirmed, and the whole 9 yards. When I see Lutheran, what sticks out in my mind is that I'm 8 years old and I'm sitting in our church in Riverside, California. And this pastor, who I still remember, his name was Pastor Kruger. And he was an old German guy.
Doesn't sound Lutheran at all.
Right. And we had this big church and he had this pulpit that you walked upstairs to get up to. And he would give a sermon up on top and be looking down at you. And I'd be sitting there and as his sermon went on, it got louder and louder and louder. And before it was over, he was banging on the pulpit saying, "You will repent. You will," scare the living daylights out of me. So, but I stuck with it. So that's on my mind.
My name is Kenny Halftap. I don't belong here, but I am a lifelong Lutheran, several generations back. My ancestry goes back to Germany as well, and I lost my way a little bit, and some life circumstances have brought me to kind of recenter my life. And then the first thing I thought about was getting back to church, so I'm glad to do that. And I think the first word that comes to my mind is liturgy. I mean, it's kind of what I've always got a kick out, not kick, I mean, I've always enjoyed that. You know, because I've been to the contemporary, and just, you know, the one thing about the contemporary services that I've been to are that you can miss the first half hour and not miss anything, right?
I won't tell you.
Or they do a lot of the, you know, so the church that we went to, for the last 10 years, which was a Nazarene church, I really couldn't get on board, you know.
Yeah.
It was a great for a debate, but I always was on the losing side, but I said, you know, but they always, the first half hour was music only, so I said, well, I can, you know, so okay, now, don't have to be a time.
Yeah.
And we started here, I think I told you the story, and again, it was convenience, you had a Saturday evening service that was great for us, so I'm dating myself a little bit.
Oh, yeah, we dissolved that when I first got here and everyone blamed me.
Yeah.
Or thank you. Or thanked you.
Well, the problem was that service literally became a small group where the pastor showed up. It was like 10, 15 people. And it just became, okay, is this really how we want to spend our day?
Right.
But,
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Everything comes down to just.
Yeah, it had its pros for sure. Yeah, well, I'm glad you're here.
Thank you.
Dave.
Dave Ritter, I am a lifelong Lutheran. I was baptized at North Community Church down Morse Road. Mom and Dad left that church and started Lamb of God Lutheran Church up on Sunbury Road. That's where I was confirmed. So we went from the ALC over to the Wisconsin Synod. So I was really brought up in the Wisconsin Synod and confirmed in that church. Most of my clients now are Missouri Synod. So I have a big, I guess, umbrella of different synods that I belong to, or at least have contact with. But I'm also married to my wife and my first husband for over 40 years.
You're her first.
I'm her first husband. Saying, lucky you, right?
We pray for Sue daily.
So we got married in a Catholic church. I'm a German Lutheran. She's an Irish Catholic. We're not changing churches, right? So we go to both churches. We go to both services. We typically either go to 5 o'clock over here, same mass, and then 10 o'clock here, or we go 9 o'clock here and then 10 o'clock over there. We've been doing that for close to 40 years. And so when I think of Lutheran, and I don't think of this, but I've had priests tell me this, that you guys are like Catholic light, right?
Yeah. Well,
Right. And yeah. Catholic light. But I told a priest, he didn't really like this. I said, no, we're just Reformed Catholics. He didn't quite like that, but you know, I love my life. He puts up with that stuff.
Your Dave is also, if you don't know, our private guy. So whenever we do action teams and we get that lovely money comes from private and Dave. So
I love that one, live generously, I get more comments on
Yeah.
that one.
Isn't that cool shirt? Yeah. It's the best marketing technique we have.
He's pretty much said everything by me.
You didn't say your first what to do. First thing that comes in your mind.
First thing, I guess, non-structure.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Jordan. So I don't know, see me back there. I was raised Methodist, so Methodist, I remember kind of hear these. The first word I would think of is community, and that kind of goes back to the message from this Sunday where everyone kind of has different, follow different ways and just this kind of community stuff together and as it is. And some of the green stuff too.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks.
I'm Kelly. I've been a lifelong Lutheran, and I would say my word is grace. And I'm his better half.
Not yet.
Yes, you're engaged.
Congrats. Congrats.
What time?
Yeah.
So my name's Casey. I grew up Catholic, like 1 through 8 at Catholic school, went to a Jesuit high school, so I got all of the spectrum of Catholicism. And then this past year I became Catherine to Lutheran Church. I know some Well, I don't like this, I prefer also Lutheran, but I think it's just a perspective that I come from. I may have been too harsh being young and rushed into religion as harsh as like the 2000, I'm not sure. But the first thing that comes to mind, I'm surprised no one said this, was Martin Luther for me, and being kind of a rebel.
Yeah, that's what we're gonna talk about here, a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, so that's probably what I come to my mind first.
Okay.
My name is Catherine Idle, lifelong Lutheran. I was baptized actually at First English. I would say the thing that comes to me with Lutheran is like easygoing. Like I tell all my friends who don't go to church, I'm like, it's so nice to be a Lutheran. Like you don't feel like guilted or obligated, and it's like a nice community, you know, especially like about like Catholicism. Sorry for the.
Sorry. Listen, I go to some bad Bible study over there and I just tell them I'm the token Lutheran, right?
And they claim you.
They do. I know they don't. Sorry.
That's all right.
And Catherine's dad made Casey come, so.
I didn't think you'd come to
Oh.
no, and then my dad said, I expect you to.
We know who Casey was.
I'm Manuela Mylander, and I have been Lutheran for the last 20 years. I grew up in a non-denominational Christian church where my dad was a pastor, and so it's quite different. I know some of you, I'm gonna ruffle little feathers, but I am not into the liturgy. I like the Lutheran, I like some of the traditions, but the liturgy to me looks like fluff that we put in because we don't have anything to say. And so that's kind of the way I look at it, but anyway, and so my husband had been a lifelong Lutheran, and so I've been one for 20 years.
Hi, good evening. My name is Marsha Lord, visiting Peace currently, and being a lifelong Lutheran. Also, my grandfather was a pastor. I've got 3 uncles that are pastors, so I was basically doomed from the beginning. But being a Lutheran the whole time, I thought, I really want to take this class to really learn more about, what's all going on. But for everything that you guys have been saying, what words, I'm like, yeah, I popped in, but just add some humor, coffee, and potlucks.
So here's some people. Well, glad you're here.
Thank you.
My name is Ron Tonjes. I've been, I think, a Lutheran since I was born. But she was just saying, the first thing when I went to college, I was told that I was in the stand-up, sit-down church. So, because we're always standing up and sitting down. The second thing is that in terms of where I grew up and what have you, the first words that anybody talks to me about are Missouri Synod. Are you a Missouri Synod Lutheran? Or are you a Catholic?
Yeah.
That's the only 2 religions that where I grew up they recognize.
Okay, interesting, awesome. That's everybody, right? Okay. Well, I'm Doug, and I know most of you, but I grew up always lifelong Lutheran. Didn't think I would be a pastor, and everyone that knew me didn't think I would be a pastor. But I grew up at All Saints. I grew up at All Saints in Worthington, and kind of a funny little side story. We were talking today at lunch here. Somehow it came up with how we've changed over the years in terms of noisy children in church. And we're all thankful that, except we don't like the people that give the nasty glares when the babies, so we were kind of commenting on that, and I brought up that my pastor growing up, his name was David Allery, he's deceased now, but I remember one time from the pulpit while he was preaching, and this was in the days when you were preaching, I don't know whose idea this was, you dim the lights. Like, what a dumb idea that is, right? And he was preaching, and this baby was making some noise in like the 5th row, and he just stopped preaching, crossed his arms, and said, "I'll wait." Oh, can you imagine doing that today? Like that family would be. But no, I grew up Lutheran. I love being a part of the youth group and but another funny story is I was a horrible confirmation student and they actually, our associate pastor is now our national bishop, Elizabeth Eaton. And she was with Dave Olery and they called my parents and said, if Doug doesn't shape up, he can't come back. And
wow.
so our now national bishop Elizabeth Eaton came to install, and I think I might have shared some with you this story, but she came to install the president of seminary at the time, Rick Barger. So she preached a sermon and then she was serving communion and the wine's coming up and she's looking down at the bread, handing it, doing this, and I come up. She didn't know I was there, and I put my hand out and she takes the bread, was about to put it in my hand, put it back on the plate and smacks me. I was with Carl Hampton, the pastor at Messiah in Rendsburg, and he just looked at me and said, dude, you just got smacked by the. So, but I actually became motivated to become a pastor when I worked at Camp Moana in Mansfield. All through college, I worked there during the summers, and I think I had it in the back of my head that this was something to think about someday, but it was working in a community like that kind of just changed my life. And I saw what it meant to kind of be doing something like ministry among students with a bunch of peers and all in the same faith. It was just life-changing for me. And so I didn't go straight into seminary, luckily. Needed to grow up a little once I graduated from OU. Worked in sales for a while. And then I went into seminary. See, I graduated college in 90 and I went into seminary in 95 and graduated in 99. Then I started a church in Dublin, a mission church. I was there for 6 years. We worshiped in an elementary school. It was super exciting. It was a great experience for me. And then at the time, Pastor Kai, who was here, came to me and said, do you want to interview for an opening we have at Peace? And I said, no. And the rest is history. So I've been here 16 years now. And so what we're going to do today, and some of you came in after I said this, so I just want to share that the next 5 weeks, we're going to cover today's Martin Luther. I'm going to try to shoot for about an hour each class. Next week, we're going to talk about this word grace that some of you brought up. And then the third week, we'll talk about sacraments and what they are and how do we understand them? How are they different from the Catholic Church? We're going to talk about how we read the Bible, especially as ELCA Lutherans, and what worship is will be the last week. What worship is and what it isn't. And that's a really interesting one because there's a lot of ways that we look at worship today that aren't really how worship's supposed to be viewed. So that'll be the last day. But today, this guy, Martin Luther, as you said, Casey, you said it, this crazy rebel. I'll go through some facts about him, but then I want to kind of get into a little bit of what motivated him and what he didn't want to see happen. So he was born in 1483 in Eiselbahn. Has any of you ever been to Germany? Did you go to any of the Luther stuff? Yeah. Oh, you did with us, yeah. Yeah, we took a whole group there. So some of the pictures you're going to see are from our trip. We did some of the travels of Luther. Now, a big thing that was going on at the time of Luther, and this is huge to keep in mind throughout everything that he did, was the plague. The Black Death makes COVID look like nothing. I'm sure many of you know that. A fourth of all children died before the age of 3 in those days. A fourth of all children. So picture this affecting everything that you think about in life. I mean, look at what 2 years of COVID or 3, whatever we want to call it, of COVID did for our world. And then picture a fourth of every children dies by the age of 3. And it was a horrible death. His father and mother were really hard on him. They were peasants. He was an altar boy and in the choir. And so if you think about the plague, though, What do you think that does to a person's understanding of God? I'm gonna. Yeah.
Why would God do this?
Right, yeah, and picture. Yeah, so you think, okay, God is doing this, where does that lead your thoughts then? I mean, what do you think were some theological concepts of the day?
People were causing this, people sinning were causing it.
Yeah, oh, for sure, yeah, people sinning causing it,
I
yeah,
was gonna say unforgiving God.
an unforgiving God, a wrathful God, yeah. I mean, this horror that just exists all around you, and this thought that, what do I do to not die of this? How do I prevent it? Is it something that I did? Something that I said? Is it something I'm not doing? Sure, I'm getting it. So the church at the time, and I think it's really important to say this, the Catholic Church of today is not anything like the Catholic Church of then. The church then, I know all of our churches, Lutherans, every denomination has its struggles and bad apples, but the church of that day was hugely corrupt. And so we're going to get into that more. The church also could decide who got married, whose births were legitimate, who could get baptized. So it had a lot of power, and it was also, unlike today, it was, well, shouldn't say totally unlike today, but then it was basically in bed with all the government too. So the Pope and whatever kings, rulers, they were all collaborative. So here's Luther's childhood home in Eiselbahn. We went through this, took this picture. It wasn't a horrible home, but you can see not huge. And here is his very cheerful, uplifting parents.
What it looked like it's dead.
Yeah, I mean, this almost looks like you could just take that face and put it in, like, but they were hugely abusive. He was quoted once as saying, "My mother once beat me till the blood flowed." His father was a copper smelter. And then in 1501, Luther entered university. He studied music and law. In 1505, he decided to go to law school. And that's when the plague struck Erfurt, where he was. And the Black Death, as I said, was everywhere. Some were struck down, others spared, and nobody knew why. So as you kind of mentioned, God is punishing us for our sins, was the basic concept. What have we done to deserve this? And this thought, this concept was everywhere. And the church capitalizes on this. Church realizes, okay, we can make some money off of this situation. So a half of Europe's population of the previous 100 years died. A half of Europe's population died of this. 3 of Luther's very close friends died of the plague. Here's another picture of Erfurt that we took. You can see it's a lovely village today. This is a little creek that runs right through the village. And I think we sat in a little cafe right over here. So pretty place. So here's where the story takes a twist. So Luther's in law school, right? Studying to be a lawyer, obviously. And the story goes that he, on July of 1505, he's 23 years old. He's out taking a walk from one town to another when this huge storm comes up. He's terrified. Lightning's all over the place. He's freaking out for his life, and he reaches up to the sky, and as the story goes, he prays to Saint Anne. Saint Anne was kind of a mediator of the day, a little bit like Catholics might look at Mother Mary today. He prayed to Saint Anne to give a message to God, and he said, "Saint Anne, spare me from this storm, and I'll become a monk." So this, literally, this event, so it's very similar to maybe the story of St. Paul. St. Paul struck by lightning, scales cover his face, and he gets transformed from Saul to Paul. Luther, in this circumstance, as the story goes, this is one of those times where you could look, but the history of the world changed. Because he went from studying law on this certain path to all of a sudden making a pledge that he would become a monk. I should say that you can interrupt me and ask me questions along the way. I meant to say that earlier. So as I said, he prays to Saint Anne, I'll become a monk. He goes back to law school, throws a party. One thing I loved learning about Luther, he loved to party. And he gives away, picture this is the day and age where books were super expensive, hard to come by, gives away all of his law books that he obtained to other students who then loved Luther. And he lives up to this covenant, he enters the Augustinian cloister in Erfurt. Now, what do you think his father's reaction was? Yes, exactly. He was livid. Here he was going to have a living, and he becomes a monk and gives away everything he had. So here is this is the stained glass in the monastery where he studied. This is inside their chapel. It's a beautiful, beautiful chapel. You remember that? As a monk, let's see, monks in the 14 and 1500s were super poor. They didn't have food or clothing other than what they were provided with, and they renounced the world. So monks today still do some of this. I went and stayed at a Trappist monastery once in Gethsemane, in Kentucky, not too far from Nashville. It's a silent monastery. It's awful. It was awful. All right, so quick funny story about this monastery. So I went to stay there. It was kind of a period where I needed to think through a lot of things, and I thought this would be a good idea. I was on sabbatical. I thought I'm just going to stay here 4 or 5 days. Again, Carl Hamp, friend of mine, pastor from Messiah in Reynoldsburg, he ends up coming up with the same idea. We were there at the same time, which is an even worse idea. He basically showed up. It was my birthday at the time. It was in August. And he's there 5 minutes and he goes, I want to get out of here. So we went out, celebrated my birthday, come stumbling back to the monastery, and all the time they had 7 different periods, I think 7 or 8 different periods where they canted their liturgy that they usually the Psalms. So they would begin at like 2 in the morning, then 3:30, then 5, and it would go throughout most of the day, and they would chant these psalms. And it always started with, "Oh Lord, come to my protection." It always started with that. And so we kind of stumble in, and there's a speaker if you need a monk to come assist you. And we said, we should hit this button and say, "Oh, monk, come to my protection," and get the monk to come up. And we can laugh about that. And then we go back to our cells. They call them cells. And I went to bed, and a little bit later, I get this knock on the door. And it was Carl. And he's there in a towel, and he's like, "My key in my room." He went to shower, and he locked his key in his room. And I'm like, "You really need the monk to come to your assistance." So I loaned him some shorts, and he went to go get the monk. And I'm like, I gotta see this. I gotta watch this monk that can't talk help Carl. So I go into the bathroom and I hide behind the door because his door was right across the hall. And so he and the monk come, and monk's this robe, and he can't get the key in the door. So he comes into the bathroom and flicks on the light, and I'm scared. Carl looks in and goes. So anyways, that's my monk story. Sorry, I digress. So these monks were super poor, and the whole point of why I told you that story, they still renounce a lot of things. These monks renounce speaking unless it's business related. So initiates, if you're an initiate at the monastery, you're encouraged to sleep without bodily coverings, blankets, and they often whip themselves as a way of identifying with Christ. So picture this mindset, and Luther what was one of the most enthusiastic of these monks. It was just kind of his spirit. He really wanted to do everything even more so. And so he would sleep in the snow, and monks would have to come and drag him in. So it was this mindset. And again, keep in mind the plagues going on and all of this weird stuff's happening in the world. Yeah, go ahead.
Didn't that whole whipping thing start because of the plague? Like they believed they had to whip themselves to get.
Probably very much related, yeah. As some sort of way of, God, I am such an evil.
Yeah, like I do this because of what I've done in the past.
Yeah, yeah. And so this whole world is just this mindset. And so he would do this. Yeah, great point. So if you think about Luther, well, I think we already said, never mind that question. 5 years he labored in the cloisters, convinced he could never do enough. So he focused on this theology of, gosh, I can't earn enough of God's grace. I can't, always torturing himself. Always think, I don't know if you've ever been there in your own faith journeys where you're like, I just don't deserve it. But this multiplied, and that's where Luther was. So we move on, and in 1510, he was, as a monk, sent to Rome. Here's a picture from Sistine Chapel. Oh, amazing. And he goes to Rome, and keep in mind, this is a day where he didn't have an animal to ride or anything like that. So he walks from his home in Germany to Rome. It took him 2 months to walk there. So he walks to Rome. This is the same time where Michelangelo is doing a lot of his work during the Renaissance. First big city Luther has ever seen, and he realized the opulence that was involved. You go to Rome, I mean, even today you go to Rome, and you're like, oh my gosh, where did this money come from? All of these beautiful chapels, and then other things he would see were, and it was encouraged of Catholics in the day, more so than today. I mean, there's still Catholic pilgrimages, but back then you would go see, like, you would pay to go look at like some holy remains. Like, here's a saint so-and-so. It would be expected that you would go visit this, and of course it came with a fee. And so he saw this all over the place, fees for everything. And he realized that this was about as much about money as it was religion, and really bothered him. St. Peter's is being built at the Luther's like watching this construction take place as he's in Rome, and a lot of it was done from money that was raised taking advantage of people of the day, which we'll get to in just a second. Pope Leo the 10th, he at the time was famous for, I mean, it wasn't huge public knowledge, but a lot of people understood that Pope Leo the 10th was often found having cake with naked little boys. So there's a lot of corruption going on, and Luther's really struggling with this. And in 1511, Luther gets sent then to Wittenberg. Here's 2 pictures. Obviously, this is Luther and that's Luther. And when we were there, it was the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. So a big celebration. And just if you're ever there, there's a wonderful beer garden right over there. Wittenberg's tiny compared to where he was from, Erfurt. And Johann Stopitz made him a teacher, and Luther lectures on the Psalms, on Romans, on Galatians, and on Hebrews. And he's struck by a revelation. He'd been taught you have to achieve salvation, learns all you need to do is open your hands and receive it. So Luther spends this time, because he's instructed to teach some of these books, and it was Romans in particular that really jumped out to Luther. Romans and some of the other epistles, he realizes what Paul is saying is basically you're saved by grace through faith. But instead of this lashing, whipping yourself, sleeping in the snow, all of these things, he starts to turn a corner and he starts to see all I have to do really, Paul tells me, is receive this grace. Open my hands and say, yes, I accept it. So he realizes it's all about you and God, and no earthly institution can stand between you and God. And he's quoted as saying, at this, I found myself being born again. So that's Luther's definition of being born again. He kind of leaves this old understanding of faith and embraces something new. So then here is this guy named Johan Tetzel, and he sells what are called indulgences. Now this was Luther's big premise. Let me grab a tissue here. So Luther, and again, please interrupt me along the way here. So Luther, he's preaching a sermon one day, and Johan Tetzel shows up outside of his church. He worked for Rome, and he's one of the seller of indulgences. And what indulgences were? Have you ever heard of this? Most of you have. Okay. So you have, keep in mind again the plague. You have loved ones that have died, an aunt or an uncle or whatever, brother, sister, and the understanding that was taught of the day is there's this place called purgatory. And your loved ones go to purgatory where they live in some sort of torment until they paid off their sins. And then it's decided at some point that either you go down or you go up. Now, if you want to get your beloved relative out of purgatory sooner, guess what you can do?
Wow.
You can pay the church, and lo and behold, and so the sale of indulgences helped do that. This is what built St. Peter's, was this sale of indulgences. This is where the money came from. And so Tetzel is famous for saying, when the coin in the coffer rings, then the soul of heavenward sings. And so huge money maker, as you can imagine, everything going on in the world at the time. Here's a picture of one of the coffers. So you would pay. And then we actually saw in Germany, I don't know if I have a picture of it or not, you would get a document saying that you had paid this. And so-and-so's now free from purgatory. Really pretty good principle. Thought maybe we should bring it back. So Luther finally gets the courage, and in 1517, October 31st, why we celebrate Reformation Sunday on that day, well, I should say Protestants celebrate Reformation Sunday on that day, he writes 95 theses. And unfortunately, we learned in Germany, we've always been taught that he nailed them to the door, right? In Germany, they said, yeah, that's a myth. But it was common to post protests about things. I mean, it's kind of like a community bulletin board. And so he posts, wherever it was that you posted them in the day, he posts these theses. And what he's basically doing is saying where he thinks the church of the day is corrupt. Why he thinks it's become more about the money, that the Pope shouldn't have the authority that the Pope has. He does a whole laundry list. I don't know, have any of you ever seen the 95 Theses?
Got a copy in my.
Do you?
Mm-hmm.
It's not really easy reading. It's very old German language, and it's super slow to read. You able to make sense of most of them?
I would say probably half of them.
Yeah.
But it is tough reading.
Some of you are just.
Yeah, it's like, what is this all about?
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
It's translated into.
Yeah, yeah. There was a big Reformation fair out in Plain City that a friend of mine did out there for the Reformation, and she printed up all these copies of the 95 Theses that are.
Cool.
I'll try to bring it in.
Cool. Yeah.
Or maybe get a couple more copies of it.
Yeah. So he realizes Luther's point is it's all about repentance and what Christ has done for us. And also where he really gets into trouble is, like I said, he calls into question papal power. But here's something that often a lot of people don't know is Luther wasn't the first to do this. There were others that had spoke out against the church. As a matter of fact, there were all sorts of reformers. Most of them paid for it with their life, because when you speak out against the Pope has the power to end your life. And so that's what happened to a lot of the reformers. But Luther, the reason that he took off was because of when he did it. What do you think took place that all of a sudden turned him from an unknown to someone everyone knew?
Printing press.
Got it, yeah, the printing press. It was the internet of the day. And there are some, there's one scholar that's passed away, her name's Phyllis Tickle. But she was a brilliant scholar, and she came up with this theory that basically every 500 years, the world changes. There's something that happens that changes the world. And when you go back and you trace it, so year 500 was the Great Schism, where the church split into two. I forget what 1000 was, but then 1500 is the printing press and Martin Luther and the Reformation. And she's claiming that 2000 is the internet, and how the world has changed as a result of that. But this, I mean, a huge deal, because all of a sudden now Luther's 95 Theses are available all over Europe. It's the first time this could have happened. Other reformers may have written all sorts of protest articles and things like that, but no one ever saw them. So one thing we learned in Germany is Luther literally was the rock star of the day, because his writing went everywhere and people were blown away that he had the courage to do this.
I have a question.
Yeah.
In the Catholic Church, do they ever mention Luther? I mean, do they ever, like?
I was taught Martin Luther in grade school and high school.
You were, okay. I'm just wondering, because some people I've talked to said, never heard of anything about him, but
Yeah.
you were taught it in grade school.
Yeah, I think grade school and high school, I believe. There's like where I went to Jesuit high school specifically taught a lot about everything, like literally everything. So
This is part of history.
yeah.
Yeah.
I also did a Bible in a Year podcast last year, and it was done by a Catholic priest, and he specifically mentioned like, hey, we do these books. If you're a Protestant, you probably don't, and I never knew that there were extra books.
Yeah, there are.
Was that, what was that, Father Mike Schmitz?
Yeah.
Yeah, we did that.
Really?
It's a really good.
Where was that?
Podcast.
Apple podcast.
That's. Yeah, right.
I had a question on the printing press. One of the key points was that Luther translated everything into German.
Yeah.
And that was the first time. And my question is, the King James Version, is that coming from Luther's translation? Or where does it come from?
Good question. We do have a week on the Bible, so I won't spend too long on that. But yeah, Luther was one of the first to translate the Bible into German. King James comes, and actually we learned in seminary that King James is, even though it's the most popular Bible, it's considered inferior because some of the sources, there are all these different sources that Bible's scholars have used over the years, and King James used some that they determined were later resources than some of the other translations. That's about all I know, to be honest. But
Well, what was amazing is most people couldn't read.
yeah, that's true too.
So you print it in German if they can't read it, it's beautiful.
Get someone to read it for you. Still is travels more widely than it ever had. So, and I also want to. Well, thank you. Yeah, go ahead and leave that.
I think.
Do you have a relative that's?
Relatives I have in purgatory, but I have will not get them off.
Still not quite enough.
Well, Jesus disagreed. But I want to say, as we keep talking about Catholic Lutheran relations, I think we're closer today than we've been in many, many, many years. And I think There's lots of, I've even seen some Catholic leaders talking about they're hoping that someday we'll be able to share communion together, which we can't do now, but. So let me see, what did I not say here?
Well, you can. You
You
just
can, you just can't,
You have to.
and sometimes it depends.
You have to sneak it, right?
Yeah, true.
Have to sneak it well, too.
Yeah.
So as you can imagine, Luther's popularity, as I said, he becomes a rock star, and of course, the church brands him as a heretic. He saw, and this gives you a little bit of the spirit of Luther, he saw this as a confirmation that he was doing the right thing. You have a
So is he still a monk at this time?
He was still a monk, but soon to be excommunicated.
Okay.
So he grew stronger with every attack he faces. His life becomes in jeopardy, as we kind of mentioned. And here's a guy named Frederick the Wise, who was ruler of the region. Germans, their system of the time, they kind of had the almost like leftover kingdom mentality. So this was the ruler of the region where Luther lived, and he decided he liked what Luther was saying. And this guy is hugely important because he protected him. So now Luther has a powerful friend who the church has to go through in order to get at Luther. Luther made his little school at Wittenberg famous. Wittenberg, again, was kind of like Zanesville. Wasn't a well-known city, but Luther now has put it on the map, and all of a sudden people are hearing about Wittenberg and hearing about this school that Luther was a teacher at. So Wittenberg's on the map. This guy convinced Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, that Luther should be able to state his case. So Luther was kind of a smartass. And he said that the Pope was like a brothel, sarcastic and witty. Luther would attack him over and over again. And so he's not really helping his cause, but he, again, takes this as confirmation he's doing the right thing. So in 1520, the bull of excommunication from Rome was sent to Luther. The bull of excommunication, you can imagine what that is, right? It's a document saying, you're done, you're out of the church, you are nothing to us. He takes it and in a public ceremony in Wittenberg, he throws it on the fire. And so you can see the tensions are just getting larger and larger. But in 1521, he's invited to, and this is the best name of trial ever, the Diet of Worms. A diet, I guess, was a way of saying kind of a meeting or trial, and Worms was the name. It's actually Worms is the name of the town where it was held. So on the way, people ran up to him cheering, and in Erfurt, they threw a party. So again, as he's making his way to this trial, people are just cheering him on because he's suddenly saying things that they're like, finally, someone's saying this stuff. Charles V guaranteed his safety, and when he arrived in Worms, the whole city greeted him. Priests touched him as if he were a saint. So you can see kind of an attitude of people getting excited for this.
Is there a Catholic priest doing this?
Yeah, that's all there was. There was no other churches at that point, other than Orthodox. So yeah, super excited. Luther argued, one of the things that we'll talk about in an upcoming week about sacraments, Luther argued with the Catholic Church about the number of sacraments. How many sacraments do the Catholics have?
7.
7. How many do we have?
2.
2, yeah. So Luther said, okay, I get that marriage is important. I get that ordination is important. I get that confession is important. All of these are great things that we should lift up as high holy things, but a sacrament is something that's commanded of God. That's Luther's understanding. Sacrament is something that God says, do this. So in communion, Jesus takes the bread, blesses it, says, do this in remembrance of me. In baptism, the calling is go, therefore, and make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father. Yeah.
One of the things you're talking about also, how they welcomed him and touched him like he was a saint. that makes you think that all they needed was a leader. It sounds like everybody already felt that the Catholic Church had lost its way.
Yeah.
And that all they needed was someone to approve things that was had enough authority to say, this is no way to run a railroad and change things.
I wouldn't say everybody. Certainly were people that weren't a fan of his, but yeah.
Just him.
Yeah, and especially keep in mind, this is Germany. So he's kind of one of your own. It might have been very different if he was in Italy. Yeah.
So would you say, or in your research, did it sound like, his provincial leader and then Charles protected him maybe as like a political thing because the Pope was so powerful? Was this?
Charles protects him, and I've never really understood who Charles V was. He was kind of the Holy Roman Emperor. So he's like the big wig in Rome, but he's not the Pope. So he agreed to protect him, to my understanding, because of him, because of Frederick the Wise. He was so powerful, and they certainly didn't want to kick him off. And he convinced them, let's at least hear him out. And so Charles V agrees, and that's when they have this. Is that kind of get it? So yeah, he argues about the sacraments. He also says, Luther says, we repent. It's not done for us. We repent. The church doesn't get to tell you if you're forgiven or not. It's up to you and God. And so at this, he's asked, of course, to recant. And this is when Luther says one of his most famous phrases of all time. So the dudes here are saying, recant. And Luther says, I cannot and will not recant anything, for to go against conscience is neither right nor safe. Here I stand, and I can do no other. So help me God, amen. And so he has the courage to stand in front of this trial and say those words. He stands for something much larger than himself, and he was granted passage back to Wittenberg. So they're basically saying, okay, we'll let you get back to Wittenberg, but good luck. So here's a picture of where supposedly he had stood and said this. You can stand in his shoes. Some of you may remember Jared Howard, our intern here from several years ago. He went with us on the German trip. He's standing in Luther's shoes. So Luther continues to grow in popularity to the point where they're fearing now for his life and who's out to get him. And he ends up hiding away here. This is a picture that we took. Frederick the Wise hid him from the Pope, and this is Wartburg. So if you've heard of Wartburg School, it's named after this. He grows out his beard and his hair, trying to kind of live incognito for a while, and he adopts the name, and I love this name, best name ever, Junker George. Junker George is what he goes by. And he gets bored and depressed because he's not one to just hide out. He spends time, what he does to kind of spend his time is he goes into the town and he'll sit at cafes. And this goes at your question about the Bible. He sits there and he listens to people's vocabulary. And this is when he starts to translate the Bible into German, because it gives him something to do, but he didn't want to just translate it formally. He wanted to do a translation that spoke like the people spoke. So if you picture like a Bible that I don't know if any of you have the Message version or some of the translations of the Bible where they don't try to go as literal translation from Greek, but they try to do it in everyday language that we speak. So that's what Luther was trying to do, and how he began doing that. It passed his time. So he translates the entire New Testament into German in 1521. 1522, he returns to Wittenberg and he's horrified. And this is a really important point, I think. This is what's called the Peasant Revolt. So the peasants are rising up in the name of Luther, and they're starting to rebel against church leaders. And all these different groups are getting upset with each other, and they're getting physical, and there's some bloodshed that happens. In addition, monks and nuns left convents, priests go to get married, people were destroying statues and paintings from the church, violence all over the place, and Luther didn't want any of this. Here's a really important point. Luther didn't want to start a new church. It's the last thing on his mind. He wanted to reform it. That's why it's called the Reformation. He wanted the church to go, you know what? You got a point. It isn't about us raking in the money and all of this sort of thing. And obviously the church at that point wasn't going to say that, because they're very successful at what they were doing, and they were, when you're in power like that, it's hard, as you can imagine, to all of a sudden go, yeah, we're wrong. So when Luther sees this, he's horrified, because he still had hope that we could work through this. So Luther calls these peasants that are revolting, calls them minions of Satan. And as Luther got older, we see some things about him that we're not fans of. But before I get there, let's tell you who this guy is. Anyone know? This is Luther's right-hand man. You get double communion if you need this. Philip Melanchthon. Philip Melanchthon. He is really the brains. I mean, Luther was super smart, but this is the guy who was able to take what Luther was thinking and put it down. And he was really more of a theologian than Luther was. So he was able to kind of work with Luther's rough edges and kind of put it into wording that worked a little better. So with Luther, they wrote what's called the Augsburg Confessions, which is a huge, it's a big book that basically is, here's what we believe. Here's what we think is important about the faith. He's systematic. He was the systemized guy who put Luther's ideas to paper. He defended them in public, and he made them the basis of a religious education. Here's where Melanchthon lived. His house, actually a beautiful, beautiful place right there in Wittenberg. Luther goes on, and he gets married to Katharina von Bora. See a post stamp of her there. They got married in 1525 on June 13. She was a former nun. Here's a picture of the two of them together. And that's Jared. And that's in Wittenberg. So, and then I love this picture. Here's Luther's home, and this is basically his dining room table, but this is where the first Lutheran pub theology would have taken place. Because there's all these documents of all of Luther's students would come, they would drink beer at this table, and they would argue theology with each other. And Katie von Bora was sometimes loved it and sometimes didn't like it. But lots of gatherings with students there, so I love that picture. And then, I don't know if you know this, he wrote the lyrics to "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God." It's kind of, it's basically a Lutheran, for lack of a better term, fight song, but it has gone through some periods of time. Like when I was in seminary, we didn't sing it because of the militant language. So it really is, if you read the language, it's kind of a fight song. So they just kind of going through a time where they didn't like the theology behind it, but I think they've since gone back to it. But he wrote that in 1527. Legend has it, I haven't verified if it's true or not, but the music was a common pub song of the day. So he just put the lyrics to a pub song that he knew. And then in 1521, I said the New Testament into German, and in 1534, he put out a publication of the complete German Bible. So then we talked about some of the teachings, and this is Luther's Small Catechism. He wrote this in 1529. It was a two-part book. There's a large catechism, which goes more to people who want to go in depth, but the small catechism was something we put together to teach people what are the important elements of the faith. So Amelia and I and Pastor Tony have been using the small catechisms even today with our confirmation students, and they hate it. But there's some really, I mean, he goes through a description of what are the petitions of the Lord's Prayer mean? What does it mean when you say, Our Father who art in heaven? And he describes that. He goes through the 10 Commandments. What do these mean? He goes, there's a morning prayer, an evening prayer, the Apostles' Creed. He explains that. And so it's basically something that he was hoping to give to common everyday people that they could understand elements of their faith.
Have you been doing that with the kids since you've been here? Or
No, we've gone back to, that's kind of an Amelia
when
made us go back to it.
God bless her.
Yeah, and you could like that.
I went through that too, and I hated it too, but I'm glad I went through it.
Yeah, yeah, no, we do it. It's sometimes they read it, but they read it. And if they don't like it, I blame her.
She needs a raise.
Yeah, she's good. So as I said, Luther wasn't the only reformer. Here are some others that also spoke up. John Calvin is probably one of the biggest of these. Presbyterians all stem from John Calvin. The biggest difference in terms of theology, John Calvin believes in predestination. Do you know what that means?
No matter what you do, you already designated to go somewhere.
Yeah, everything's predetermined. God already knows the outcome. You can try, but it's already predetermined. I think Presbyterians have kind of stepped away from some of that theology, but it was a big deal then. Luther's not a believer in predestination. It's like we still have some say in this.
And Calvin is very popular in the western half of the great state to the north of us, where I'm originally.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Calvin Seminary.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Up in Michigan, right? So in closing then, and then if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. This is a great quote, my favorite Luther quote when he finally passed away. And I should say, as I said earlier, there were some not great things that Luther did. As he got older and got a little grumpier, he said some horrible things about Jewish people. The ELCA has, I think just within the past 10 years, issued an apology to Jewish people throughout the world saying, you know, we apologize for Luther's words.
Just 10 years ago they did that?
I think so, yeah, within the past 10 years, yeah.
Fairly recent.
Yeah.
Wow.
What did you say? I mean, what were some of the?
Oh, he had all sorts of horror. He condemned them all to hell.
It was nice.
No, it was horrible stuff. It's not hard to find it if you Google some. There's many statements that he put out.
You saw philosophical disagreements or?
Yeah, and I think it was a world that didn't like Jewish people, and so Luther just entered into that and basically condemned them all. Yeah, but not good stuff. But here's one of my favorite quotes when he died. Or before he died, he said, "When I die, I want to be a ghost, so I can continue to pester bishops, priests, and godless monks until they have more trouble with a dead Luther than they could have had with 1,000 living ones." So in 1546, in February 18th, he had a heart attack and died. But main reason that obviously we have Lutheran churches, even though he didn't want that. And we'll talk more about what that means in the upcoming weeks. So questions? Yeah.
They didn't have children, did they?
Oh, yeah.
I don't remember how many.
Like stuff that, lots of children. And Kat, she was kind of a real instigator with him. I mean, she was a real helper.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and
She would, I think what I remember hearing one time was she made the beer.
Yeah, you're right, she did.
Yeah.
And he loved her recipe.
But yeah, she was really, I mean, she was his helper.
Yeah.
Not,
And one thing we learned in Germany is he really, if anyone came to him with needs, he would often give away money, he would help, he had a lot of great things to say, because I did some research on this when COVID hit. He had an attitude of what it meant to be a person of faith during the plague. And he said, he basically had this attitude of protect yourself. If you shouldn't be around people, don't be around people, but it doesn't mean that you can't help and that we can't be there for other people. And so it was kind of a tension, just like we all wrestled with. But Katie Von Bora, his wife, had to kind of take over the purse of the two of them because he was giving away all their money. And so she took over and said, let's be diligent about this. And so my wife has often teased me that you can't just give, and so I call her Katie.
When did people start organizing themselves in a building? And not calling them Catholics, but calling themselves Lutherans?
It was right around when that peasant revolt and some of that was taking place. Lutheran churches started forming, and Luther eventually had to kind of go along with it, realizing, okay, even though this isn't what I want. So he saw that in his lifetime, and he ended up preaching at churches in Wittenberg, and so they kind of converted. So some of the existing Catholic churches, I think, became Lutheran churches. That makes sense.
Do we know if his children carried on the ministry after he passed, or
That's a good question.
I don't know anything. I know they had quite a few children.
Yeah.
But I don't know anything about what happened to them.
Anything else? Awesome. Really good. All right, okay. So next week, what did I say? Grace. Grace, yep. Yeah, awesome. Thanks all. Thank you. Thank you.
Cars that are out.
No, I can take next.
At that farm and they're convinced they're out. That's why they're grab by my like selling out to sorry.
Oh, I think all that to the well. Oh, but yeah. It's all like.
We won't see you Sunday. But if it is this month.
Hi. Okay, it's nice to hopefully you can.
I mentioned it to her with that snow sticking to the.
did you guys go to St. Paul? Hopefully you didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, my daughter.
See you.
A lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah.
I live in the Walden. I go out to Westerville, I go down Walnut all the way, I don't see the church there. So, I don't know much about it. A lot of great people come over there.
They did one time.
Just were.
I'm sure they're not. It is quite a twitch. Very,
Yeah.
like.
Yeah.
We're not there now.
You all first service?
Yeah.
I'm a deacon.
Yeah.
Second. The communion and the high school leader with the communion. You know, and sitting there. And it's true, I don't go to first service.
So you put the second service here?
Yeah, always. Yes, I am in Germany. My great grandfather's last name was Ford. Yeah, they moved to, migrated in Chicago. Yeah. Where our, and from both sides, grew up and all that. Oh, yeah. Yes, I like Harry. I don't know why I like it, but I guess that's probably it. Grandfather.
Good night.
In Indiana.
Liver, she was having.
These were our lecture.
Oh, wow.
And his daughter was Johan.
Oh,
That's
okay.
his daughter.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so she spoke at my dad's mom's funeral.
Oh, wow.
Back then.
Okay.
She was kind of his assistant here.
Yeah.
At that time.
Oh, yeah.
So I've known Suzanne, and she was one of my clients for all the time that I knew her. And so she's a lot deeper than what you see.
Dylan. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
She's done some studying.
Yeah.
Uh,
No, I agree.
but her dad, believe it or not, about 2 years after I left Capitol, he was fired. Which is very new.
Huh.
He claimed that he had a doctorate from Paris. Well, I found out he didn't, and he didn't have, he'd never been to Paris.
Oh.
So they described him as a pathological liar.
Jeez.
And
Oh, man. So you got.
I never knew what happened to Bill.
Huh.
But it's interesting, he's lived right there across from the school. He was married at that time. I think he ended up getting a divorce.
Oh, geez. Well, have a good night, Mike.